a balcony, or delivered in a televised address. According to emerging reports, the objection came quietly inside rooms where constitutional language is treated almost like scripture. By the time whispers reached palace corridors, one detail stunned insiders most. King Charles had reportedly pushed back, not against a person, not against a policy, but against changing words that would shape how history remembers his reign. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, almost nobody outside palace circles appeared to notice. Reports emerging through royal commentators and speculative media discussions suggested that what had begun as an ordinary constitutional review had gradually become something else entirely, something more sensitive, more personal, and perhaps more revealing than anyone expected. The discussion, according to various interpretations circulating among royal servers, was not centered on budgets, titles, public appearances, or succession. It was focused on language, a handful of words, a revision proposal, the kind of adjustment that, on paper, could seem procedural. But inside the monarchy, words have never been merely words. Because in royal tradition, oaths are not administrative paperwork. They are treated as declarations that outlive governments, personalities, and even reigns themselves. The coronation oath occupies an unusual place inside Britain's constitutional imagination. It is symbolic, ceremonial, historical, and at the same time, deeply consequential in how the institution understands itself. Every sovereign inherits it. Every sovereign speaks it. And every sovereign understands that once those words are spoken publicly, they become part of the permanent architecture of the crown. They do not belong to the individual monarch anymore. They become history. That is why, according to reports and interpretations now circulating through royal commentary spaces, discussions surrounding possible wording adjustments reportedly drew unusual attention. Nothing explosive at first, no dramatic declarations, no public disagreements, just conversations. But those conversations, insiders allegedly suggested, began to stretch longer than expected. Meetings became quieter. Briefings reportedly became narrower. Administrative discussions that normally moved quickly were said to encounter unusual hesitation. And then one detail started appearing repeatedly across interpretations of the story. Charles was uncomfortable, not publicly, not emotionally, not visibly, privately. Reports suggest concerns were raised through established channels rather than confrontation. Different accounts describe a measured resistance, not rejection of change itself, but concern over what changing the oath could represent. Some interpretations claim Charles viewed the language less as a political instrument and more as a bridge between sovereigns. Across generations, that distinction matters. Because King Charles has often been portrayed as a monarch interested in modernization. Throughout years of public life, he developed a reputation for adaptation, dialogue, and measured reform, which made this reported hesitation all the more unexpected to observers. Why draw the line here? Why become cautious over wording? That question, according to those speculating on palace dynamics, slowly transformed routine discussion into something heavier. Senior advisors reportedly moved carefully. Language became controlled. Briefings became narrower. And what might once have been categorized as constitutional housekeeping began attracting quiet interest from those who spend their lives reading between royal lines. Because if the king was objecting even privately, then observers wondered whether something larger sat underneath. Not politics, not controversy, legacy. There is a difference. Politics asks what works today. Legacy asks what remains for. Morale. Some early interpretations suggested Charles may have viewed the oath not as his personal statement, but as borrowed language, something inherited rather than owned. If true, that would explain why adjustments reportedly created discomfort. To alter wording could mean more than updating ceremony. It could alter continuity itself. And inside institutions built on continuity, that question carries unusual weight. No official confrontation emerged. No dramatic palace acknowledgement followed. Only silence. But royal silence has always had its own language. The longer nothing was clarified, the louder speculation became. Because people began realizing this discussion was never truly about modern phrasing or constitutional mechanics. It was about whether a monarch should preserve inherited promises exactly as received or reshape them for a changing era. And that question, according to those watching closely, was only beginning to unfold. But this wasn't simply about Changi. G phrases it touched a promise stretching back centuries. Long before cameras, processions, and modern headlines, monarchs were bound by words spoken before the nation. And once spoken, those words rarely changed without consequence. That is what makes moments like this so difficult to dismiss. Because outside the world of monarchy, words are often treated as flexible. They evolve, they adapt, they are revised to fit new expectations. But inside royal tradition, certain words are expected to carry something heavier than meaning alone. They carry continuity, memory, obligation. They become less like statements and more like inherited promises passed from one sovereign to another. And for centuries, coronation oaths have occupied exactly that space. Long before broadcasts transformed royal ceremonies into global spectacles, before analysts dissected every gesture and every expression, the oath existed as something more intimate and more serious. It was never designed as performance. I see a declaration of responsibility spoken under circumstances intended to remind both monarch and public that power was not unlimited. Authority came attached to expectation. That is why historians often return to these moments. Not because every word changes history overnight, but because the words reveal how a monarchy sees itself. Across generations, ceremonies have evolved, traditions have adapted. Certain rituals that once seemed permanent quietly disappeared. Others were modernized to reflect changing societies. Monarchs adjusted tone, presentation, and public engagement. Yet through all of those transitions, institutions worked carefully to preserve one central illusion, or perhaps one central belief that continuity remained intact. Change was permitted. Disruption was not, and that distinction has always mattered, because monarchy survives through a paradox. It must feel ancient while remaining relevant. It must appear permanent while constantly adjusting underneath the surface. I see too rigid, and it risks becoming distant, too flexible, and it risks becoming unrecognizable. That balancing act has defined more than one reign. Royal observers often point to the way ceremonies slowly transformed across the 20th and 21st centuries. Some changes were welcomed. Others generated discomfort before eventually becoming accepted. But in almost every case, adaptation worked because the public could still recognize the institution beneath the adjustments. The oath occupies unusual territory inside that equation. It is not simply decoration. It represents the line between individual monarch and inherited office, which is why discussions surrounding wording, even speculative ones, draw attention far beyond constitutional circles. Because people instinctively understand something larger is being debated. Not whether words can change, but whether changing them changes meaning. And according to interpretations emerging around this reported moment, that deeper question may explain why concerns reportedly surfaced at all. King Charles has spent much of public life occupying an unusual position inside royal history. He has often appeared open to evolution while remaining deeply invested in preserving institutional identity. For decades, observers described him as someone willing to modernize presentation without dismantling foundation. That approach helped shape expectations once he became king. Many assumed reform would continue. Many assumed adaptation would accelerate. But adaptation has limits, and some interpretations now suggest Charles may distinguish between changing how monarchy speaks and changing what monarchy promises. That difference is subtle. But inside institutions built across centuries, subtle differences become defining ones. Public image matters, relevance matters, connection matters. Yet continuity carries its own authority, because every monarch eventually faces the same impossible question. How much can be altered before inherit? Man emerged, ants becomes reinvention, and perhaps that is why reports of hesitation drew so much attention. Not because resistance itself was shocking, but because it hinted at a line that even a modernizing king may not want crossed. If true, then what appeared at first to be procedural discussion suddenly becomes something much more revealing, a quiet struggle between preservation and reinvention, unfolding beneath official silence. And as those interpretations continued spreading, another realization began taking shape. Maybe the conversation was never about ceremonial language at all. Then came the question nobody expected palace circles to ask. Reports suggest the proposed adjustments initially appeared technical until some realized their implications could extend far beyond ceremony. That was the moment the atmosphere reportedly changed. Until then, according to interpretations circulating among royal commentators and constitutional observers, The discussion had remained inside familiar territory. Reviews happen. Language evolves. Institutions revisit procedures. Nothing unusual about that, at least not at first. The earliest accounts suggested the proposed revisions were framed as modest refinements, updates intended to reflect contemporary expectations while preserving the spirit of tradition. Administrative, measured, carefully phrased, the kind of proposal that rarely escapes specialist conversations. But monarchy has always possessed an unusual sensitivity to language. Because language inside the institution does not simply describe authority, it helps define it. And once people reportedly began examining not just what could be adjusted but what those adjustments might imply, the conversation slowly transformed. The questions became heavier. Observers started asking whether revisions would merely modernize expression or subtly alter meaning. And those are not the same thing. According to differing interpretations emerging around the discussions, there was never one singular, concern. Instead, multiple perspectives reportedly began competing beneath the surface. One interpretation suggested updates would help reflect a changing relationship between monarchy and public life. Supporters of this thinking allegedly viewed ceremonial evolution as a natural part of how institutions remain relevant across generations. To them, preserving legitimacy meant demonstrating adaptability. But another interpretation reportedly raised a different concern. What happens when modernization begins affecting inherited commitments? That question lingered, because once words become symbolic, even small adjustments stop feeling small. And coronation language carries unusual symbolic gravity. To critics of change, or at least those reportedly urging caution, the concern was not immediate disruption. It was precedent. Not what one revision meant today, but what future revisions might justify tomorrow. Because institutions rarely change all at once, they shift gradually. One phrase becomes optional. One interpretation becomes broader. One tradition becomes symbolic rather than binding. And eventually people realize the institution feels different, even if they cannot identify the exact moment it changed. That fear, whether reasonable or overstated, reportedly began surfacing in private interpretations of the discussions. Suddenly, the conversation no longer sounded technical. It sounded philosophical. And according to those reading the situation closely, that shift created visible tension inside advisory circles. Reports and speculation suggested opinions were no longer entirely aligned. Some reportedly argued monarchy had always survived through adaptation. Others allegedly warned that survival depended on preserving lines that future generations would recognize. Neither side appeared to reject continuity. Neither side appeared to oppose relevance. But they disagreed on where continuity ended and reinvention began. And perhaps that disagreement explains why Palace Sill became so noticeable. Because silence inside royal institutions rarely calms speculation. It intensifies it. No immediate clarification emerged. No public reassurance followed. No detailed explanation appeared to settle interpretations. Instead, the absence of certainty created its own momentum. Royal commentary expanded. Constitutional observers began drawing wider conclusions. And ordinary audiences became unexpectedly invested in a question that had once seemed impossibly niche. Why would wording matter so much? Why would language create hesitation? Why would discussions remain so quiet? Those questions kept growing because people sensed something familiar underneath them. This no longer felt like a conversation about ceremonial phrasing. It felt like something older. A struggle that every institution eventually faces. How much can be updated before inheritance starts becoming reinterpretation? And according to the interpretations now circulating, that was the point where attention, Tion reportedly shifted toward one person not because he spoke loudly, but because he reportedly stopped treating the issue as procedural. And that was reportedly when Charles made his position unmistakably clear. For a monarch often portrayed as reflective and measured, this moment reportedly carried unusual firmness, not loudness, not confrontation, not spectacle, firmness. And according to the interpretations that had begun circulating through royal commentary and constitutional discussion, that distinction may have mattered more than anything else. Because by this stage, the conversation had reportedly moved beyond technical language and entered territory that monarchs rarely discuss openly. Inheritance, responsibility, and the invisible line between protecting tradition and reshaping it. For weeks at least, according to speculative interpretations and emerging commentary, the atmosphere surrounding the reported discussions had remained difficult to read. Observers searched for some expected compromise. Others assumed adaptation was inevitable. After all, King Charles had spent years cultivating the image of someone capable of respecting history while acknowledging change. That image mattered. It became part of how people understood him. He was often described as thoughtful rather than impulsive, patient rather than rigid, interested in continuity but not imprisoned by it, which is precisely why reports of hesitation carried unexpected weight. Because if someone known for gradual evolution suddenly became cautious, observers naturally wondered whether he was seeing consequences others were missing. According to various interpretations, Charles' concern was reportedly framed less as opposition and more as stewardship. That word began appearing repeatedly. Stewardship, not ownership, not control. Stewardship suggests something temporary, something inherited, something held in trust before being passed forward. And if those interpretations reflected reality in any meaningful way, then the reported objection begins to sound very different. Not a king defending personal preference. A king questioning whether certain promises belong to him to rewrite it all. That possibility changed the emotional center of the story. Because monarchy is often misunderstood as power. But inside its own traditions, monarchy frequently presents itself as restraint. The sovereign receives immense symbolism but also inherits limits. And perhaps nowhere is that tension clearer than in moments like these. Reports suggest Charles reportedly distinguished between adaptation and replacement. Ceremony can evolve, presentation can evolve, connection with the public can evolve. But inherited commitments, at least according to some interpretations of the situation, occupy a different category. That distinction reportedly became increasingly important as discussions continued. And reactions, according to speculation surrounding advisory circles, were not entirely uniform. So, I reportedly viewed caution as wise. Others allegedly worried that resisting adjustment risked appearing disconnected from a changing society. Neither position appeared simple, because both arguments carried emotional force. One side feared losing continuity, the other feared losing relevance. And somewhere between those positions reportedly stood the king himself, carrying expectations that stretched in opposite directions. Preserve, adapt, honor, modernize, lead, protect. Every monarch inherits those contradictions, but timing may have intensified everything. Because discussions surrounding symbolism never happen in isolation. Every royal gesture becomes interpreted. Every hesitation becomes analyzed. Every silence becomes narrative. And perhaps that explains why this moment reportedly attracted attention beyond constitutional circles. People were not just asking what decision would be made. They were asking what the decision would reveal. About the reign. About priorities. About how, Charles sees the institution he inherited. Because eventually the discussion stopped sounding procedural altogether. It became personal. Not personal in the ordinary sense, but personal in the way legacy always becomes personal. A king does not only ask what works, he asks what survives him. And according to interpretations now circulating, that may have been the deeper tension underneath the reported objection, not fear of change, but caution toward becoming the monarch remembered for changing something that was never truly his alone, which left everyone watching with a larger question than before. If the king had quietly drawn his line here, what consequences would follow? But every royal decision creates ripples far beyond palace walls. No official confrontation appeared in public, but inside institutional circles, interpretations multiplied. That was the strange part. If there had been a statement, denial, or even a carefully worded clarification, the moment might have passed as another brief cycle of royal speculation. But according to interpretations and commentary that continued building around the reported discussions, nothing definitive emerged. No visible disagreement, no public correction, just an unusual absence of certainty. And in institutions built on symbolism, silence rarely ends a conversation. It expands it, because the monarchy has long understood something most public institutions learn the hard way. People do not simply react to announcements, they react to what remains unsaid. Reports suggest that as attention around the alleged disagreement grew, communication became increasingly disciplined. Language reportedly remained careful. Public messaging stayed broad. Official channels appeared to maintain distance from the speculation itself. which only encouraged more interpretation. Some observers described the restraint as standard institutional practice. Royal households rarely comment on internal deliberations. Others wondered whether the silent Coronation reflected caution not because the issue was explosive, but because its implications were difficult to define. After all, how do you publicly explain a disagreement over symbolism without making the symbolism feel political? That tension reportedly created an unusual environment. No one appeared eager to confirm anything, but nobody seemed eager to dismiss it either. And once that space opened, interpretation rushed in. Media discussion accelerated. Royal commentators offered competing readings. Constitutional observers widened the frame. Suddenly, a conversation that began around ceremonial language started absorbing much larger questions. What is the monarchy preserving? What is it adapting? Who decides? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when continuity and modernization stop moving in the same direction? Different camps slowly began emerging around those questions. Not formal groups, not official positions, but competing instincts. One instinct argued that institutions survive, because they evolve, that refusing adjustment risks turning tradition into performance rather than living meaning. According to this interpretation, updating language would not weaken monarchy, it would demonstrate confidence. But another instinct pushed back. This view suggested monarchy survives precisely because it does not move with every cultural shift. That restraint itself creates stability. That inherited rituals carry authority because they resist becoming endlessly negotiable. And once those arguments appeared, the debate stopped belonging exclusively to palace circles. Public fascination took over, because royal symbolism occupies a unique place in public imagination. People who never discuss constitutional structure suddenly care deeply when ritual appears uncertain. People who ignore procedure become invested when tradition appears unsettled, not because they memorize the oath language, but because symbols act as emotional anchors. And whether supporters realize it or not, mass AN emerged. Many people want monarchy to feel older than politics even when politics inevitably surrounds it. That emotional contradiction gave the story momentum. The more interpretations circulated, the less this looked like a disagreement about ceremonial wording. Instead, it started reflecting something broader and more uncomfortable, an institution attempting to answer two demands at once: remain recognizable, remain relevant, move forward, stay unchanged. And somewhere inside those impossible expectations sat a monarchy attempting to maintain balance without appearing divided, which may explain why reactions became so intense despite the absence of any confirmed confrontation. People sensed the deeper stakes, because this was never really about sentences. It was about identity. And identity debates rarely stay contained once they begin. Soon, observers stopped asking whether revisions would happen. They started asking what the discussion revealed about the future of the crown itself. Outside, observers soon realized the disagreement represented something larger. Every generation inherits a monarchy, but no generation inherits permission to redefine it without debate. That realization began changing the tone of the conversation. Because by now, at least according to the interpretations surrounding the reported discussions, people were no longer arguing over wording alone. The language question had become something larger, a reflection of a tension that has followed monarchy through every era. How does an institution remain connected to the present without loosening the threads that tie it to the past? That tension is not new. It simply changes shape. Each generation believes it is confronting unprecedented pressures. Each generation feels convinced that modernization is unavoidable. And yet, every generation also discovers the same uncomfortable truth. Institutions survive not only because they change, but because some parts of them resist changing. Monarchy has always lived in a side that contradiction. It must feel familiar enough to endure and flexible enough to remain meaningful. Too much distance creates irrelevance. Too much adaptation creates uncertainty. And once people began interpreting the reported disagreement through that lens, the entire discussion started sounding less like constitutional procedure and more like a philosophical argument hidden beneath ceremonial language. Because questions of tradition rarely remain technical for long. They become emotional, they become symbolic, and eventually they become personal. King Charles occupies a particularly complicated place inside that debate. For decades before becoming sovereign, he built a public identity around careful evolution. He often appeared interested in updating approaches, encouraging dialogue and making long-standing institutions feel responsive rather than frozen. Observers spent years describing him as someone who respected continuity while accepting that permanence without adaptat. Monash, Ion eventually becomes fragile. That image followed him into the crown, and with it came expectations. Many expected a reign defined by measured reform. Others hoped for stronger preservation. Some imagined transformation. Others wanted reassurance. The challenge was never choosing one side. The challenge was carrying all those expectations at once, which may explain why interpretations of this reported moment attracted unusual attention. Because if a figure associated with thoughtful modernization reportedly became cautious around ceremonial language, people naturally began searching for meaning. Not because caution itself was surprising, but because of where the caution appeared. There is something different about symbolic language. Policies can be amended, strategies can evolve, public priorities can shift, but ceremonial words occupy another category entirely. They create continuity across people who never meet. They connect one reign to another. They remind audiences that institut, ions claim to stand for something larger than current circumstances. That is why moments involving ceremonial language often generate stronger reactions than outsiders expect. People hear debates about wording. What they actually hear are questions about identity, and history offers plenty of reminders. Again and again, monarchies survived because they adapted carefully. Again and again, they faced criticism either for changing too quickly or not quickly enough. The pattern repeats because monarchy is not simply inherited, it is continuously interpreted. That interpretation never truly ends, which is why the competing visions surrounding this reported disagreement became so compelling. One vision suggested that preserving relevance requires updating inherited language. Another suggested relevance depends on demonstrating that some principles remain stable. Neither side claimed to oppose the institution. Both claimed to protect it, but they imagined protection differently. And perhaps that, I asked, that was the deeper tension all along. Not whether monarchy should change, but who gets to decide what kind of change still counts as continuity. By now, observers were beginning to realize something else. The constitutional arguments were important. The symbolism mattered. The institutional implications mattered. But underneath all of it sat something quieter, something human. Because eventually every discussion about inheritance becomes a discussion about the person holding it. Yet beneath every constitutional argument sat a far more personal question. For kings, policy fades, but symbols remain. That may be the quiet truth sitting underneath every interpretation of this reported moment. Because laws change, governments rise and fall, public priorities move with each generation. Yet monarchies survive by persuading people that something deeper continues beneath those changes. Not control, not permanence, continuity. And continuity depends on memory. By now, the conversation surrounding reported disagreement had moved far beyond ceremonial wording or institutional caution. People were no longer asking what language should say. They were asking what future generations would remember. That question carries unusual weight for any monarch, but perhaps especially for one who waited decades to inherit the role. Because becoming sovereign late in life creates a strange relationship with history. Most kings inherit power with decades ahead of them. King Charles inherited something different: expectation, memory, comparison. A lifetime spent preparing for a position that only became fully his after generations had already formed assumptions about what his reign should mean. That burden changes perspective. Every decision becomes measured against inheritance. Every adjustment invites comparison. Every hesitation becomes interpreted as intention. And perhaps that is why, according to the interpretations now surrounding this moment, the reported objection resonated emotionally, rather than politically, because people began imagining the question through a more human lens. If you wait your entire life to inherit something, do you see yourself as its author or its caretaker? That distinction may explain why symbolism suddenly felt so important, not because symbols are stronger than policy, but because symbols survive policy. Years from now, historians will not remember every administrative detail of a reign. They rarely do. Instead, they look for defining moments. Moments that reveal instinct. Moments that reveal priorities. Moments where a leader quietly shows what they believe they were protecting. That is why observers reportedly became fascinated by this story despite its unusual subject. people sensed a larger question forming. What does Charles believe he inherited? A platform to reshape or a trust to preserve? Because monarchy has always depended on a peculiar agreement with the public. The institution asks citizens to accept continuity even as individuals change, one sovereign leaves, another arrives, but the promise remains recognizable. That promise is symbolic more than practical, and once people believe symbols are unstable, trust becomes harder to maintain. Perhaps that concern explains why interpretations around continuity gained emotional force. Not because everyone agrees, not because everyone values tradition equally, but because people instinctively understand inheritance. Parents inherit values, nations inherit stories, monarchies inherit ritual, and each generation must decide whether preserving something means protecting it or changing it carefully enough that people still recognize it afterward. That is not an easy burden, especially for someone entering the role already carrying decades of public expectation. By this point, another question had quietly emerged. Not whether the reported objection happened exactly as interpreted, but why the idea itself felt believable to so many. Maybe because people understand some thing about legacy that institutions often avoid saying out loud. You do not become remembered only for what you build. Sometimes you become remembered for what you refuse to alter, and perhaps that possibility lingered behind every discussion, every interpretation, every silence. Because one day historians may look back and ask not whether a revision happened, but what the moment revealed about the king who faced the choice. And in the end, the outcome may matter less than what the moment revealed. Crowns pass, ceremonies end, but sometimes history remembers a reign through a single decision and a single sentence. And perhaps that is why moments like this continue to linger long after the speculation quiets. Because whether the reported disagreement unfolded exactly as interpreted or not, the reaction surrounding it revealed something deeper about how people still understand monarchy. They do not expect monarchs to control everything. They do not expect perfection, but they expect annals. They expect choices that communicate what the institution believes about itself. That expectation is powerful, more powerful sometimes than policy, because policy belongs to governments. Symbols belong to memory. And according to the interpretations that gathered around this reported moment, that may have been the real story all along. Not conflict, not resistance, not an argument over wording, but a question that every monarchy eventually confronts. What deserves to remain untouched? By now, the conversation had moved beyond personalities, beyond headlines, beyond the natural cycle of commentary and reaction. What began as reports of possible adjustments to ceremonial language gradually became a wider reflection on continuity itself. People debated modernization. People debated symbolism. People debated whether adaptation strengthens institutions or slowly changes them into something else. But beneath all of those positions sat a quieter realization. Monarchy has never depended monarchs entirely on individual monarchs. Its strength, at least in theory, comes from convincing each generation that something continues even as people change. One sovereign departs, another arrives. The institution remains. That promise has always required balance. Too much change risks uncertainty. Too little risks distance. And every reign inherits the responsibility of deciding where that balance should sit. That responsibility becomes even more complicated when expectations arrive before the reign itself. For years, people imagined what King Charles might represent once he became sovereign. Some expected transformation. Others expected preservation. Many assumed he would attempt both at the same time. Perhaps that expectation explains why this reported moment attracted such attention. Because it appeared to challenge assumptions. If interpretations are correct, the hesitation was not framed as opposition to evolution, but as caution toward changing something perceived as inherited rather, or personal. And if that interpretation contains even part of the truth, then perhaps the deeper meaning was never about refusing change. Perhaps it was about asking whether every change means progress. That question does not produce easy answers. History rarely does, because every generation eventually reaches the same crossroads and believes its decision is unique. Protect tradition, redefine tradition, preserve meaning, expand meaning. The tension never disappears. It simply returns in different forms. Which leaves one final question hanging quietly over everything. What will future generations inherit? Not documents, not ceremonies, Not even exact language, but assumptions, expectations, the invisible understanding of what the crown exists to represent. And years from now, historians may not remember every interpretation, every headline, or every rumor attached to this moment, but they may remember the feeling surrounding it. The feeling that for a brief moment people stopped doing. Masan emerged, discussing stewardship. They stopped asking what should change and started asking what should remain. And perhaps that alone explains why the conversation mattered. Because monarchy has always existed in that narrow space between movement and permanence. A space where decisions become symbols, and symbols become legacy. Then eventually the discussion fades. The headlines disappear. The institution continues. And somewhere, quietly and almost unnoticed, history records not only what happened but what people believed it meant. Because in the world of monarchy, power is often measured not by what is declared in public, but by the words a sovereign refuses to change. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.